This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today I'm bringing you my limited archetype guide for Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Over the last week or so, I've given my thoughts on every single card in the set, and in this video, I'm talking some more about limited, with a focus on the synergies within each color pair in the format. This isn't a video where I'm going to talk about the all-around best cards, like the best commons or uncommons or bombs, unless they happen to have some special synergy within a particular deck. If you want my thoughts on that sort of thing, I am planning on putting videos out on those subjects in the coming days, both the format's biggest bombs and the best commons, so stay tuned for that. You can also just check out my whole limited review, which is a lot of videos, but I do talk about every single card individually there, so you can find that sort of thing there too. For now though, let's take a look at the archetypes in this format. So this is the Werewolf set, so we're going to start with the red-green color pair, which is all about werewolves. And wolves, actually. So every color pair in this format has two signpost uncommons. One of them is just sort of a regular signpost uncommon, and the other one is a card with flashback. And for red-green, we've got Kessig Naturalist and Unnatural Moonrise as our signpost uncommons. Kessig Naturalist is, of course, a werewolf. When he's on his front side, he's just a 2-mana 2/2 that can produce mana when it attacks, but if it becomes nighttime, and more on how that happens in a second, then he turns into a wolf and werewolf lord, who is a 3/3, and still has the ability to add mana to your mana pool. And then the other card is Unnatural Moonrise, a card that turns it into night, which means all your werewolves, if they weren't already, will go to their night side. And then it also gives a stats boost, and it has flashback. So it gives you a way to make it night, like, a couple of times when it isn't night already, and that's pretty good. And obviously that's telling you, yeah, jam a bunch of werewolves into your deck. And that's sort of the plan here. So because this is the color pair where Daybound, Nightbound really matters, I'm going to talk about it a little bit here to give you more of an idea about how it works. It's not the most intuitive mechanic ever. They didn't put very good reminder text on the cards themselves, so there are some things about it that don't make a ton of sense if you don't also see these cards, the day and night cards, which will come in booster packs, and they'll show up on Arena in one way or another, I'm sure, as well. So the game does not start tracking day and night right away. It's not like there's always a status of day or night. But if you play a card with Daybound, like Kessig Naturalist, from that point on, both players continue to track day and night, and it's a global effect. It affects you and your opponent, whether it's day or night. So it becomes day when you play the Naturalist, and then from that point on, it can become night at any time any player doesn't cast any spells on their turn. So if they pass their turn, they're in their turn. On your opponent's turn, or your turn, depending on whose turn it was, it becomes night. And then it can go back to being day if a player casts 2 spells during their turn. It will then become day on the next turn. So the key thing here that isn't super intuitive, especially if you've played with werewolves before, is that the Nightbound side can come into play first. So you can cast Kessig Naturalist, and the Nightbound side comes into play. You'll note on night it says permanents enter the battlefield, Nightbound. So that means sometimes this will just be a 2-mana 3/3 werewolf lord, which when that happens, it'll be great. That's not always going to be the case, and it probably won't even always frequently be the case, but it will be the case a significant chunk of the time, and that's pretty neat. And so, that's the key thing about it that doesn't make a ton of sense at first, that the Nightbound side can come into play first on these cards. Even though what you're technically casting is the Naturalist, the Nightbound side is what comes down. All right, so with that out of the way, let's look at the Werewolf Payoffs. So we've already got the ones we've talked about, the Naturalist who turns into a wolf and werewolf lord, and Unnatural Moonrise, which that card sort of just, removes all rules about night and day and just says it is night, period. So that's what's special about it. It can turn all your werewolves, transform them all, without you having to meet the normal requirements to change night and day. Other Werewolf Payoffs include Pax Betrayal, a threaten effect that lets you scry 2 if you control a wolf or werewolf. You've also got Village Watch. This is another one of these double-sided werewolves, as they all are. Its Daybound side is not a werewolf payoff. It's just a reasonably efficient, not even that efficient, frankly, creature with haste. The other side, though, is much more imposing. It's a 5/4, and it gives wolves and werewolves you control haste. So it's a payoff for all your wolves and werewolves. You've also got Hound Tamer, which is a really good card on the front. Like, if this was just the card, it'd be great. But when it transforms, it becomes even better, giving all your wolves and werewolves trample and still holding onto the powerful activated ability. I have a Natural Moonrise there again, just to remind you about it again. Of course, I did that on purpose. But there's also Howl of the Hunt, which is a nice little aura that also untaps wolves or werewolves when you attach it. So, red-green, you're just going to have a bunch of werewolves. These are not all the werewolves. I only included the ones here that are wolf or werewolf payoffs, and there are a significant number of them. It's basically an aggro deck, a red-green aggro deck that has some pretty monstrous late game where it can turn a lot of its creatures into big scary things. In the later part of the game when both players are in top deck mode is when a lot of these werewolves can start transforming if they haven't already. So let's take a look now at the rares that fit well into this deck. Well, you've got Tovalar's Huntmaster, who not only is a werewolf himself, but makes wolf creature tokens. And on his backside, he can make wolf creature tokens even better in addition to just being bigger. But the Werewolf Payoff part comes in where it has the ability to make wolves and werewolves fight other creatures. Arlen the Pack's Hope is, technically not a werewolf, but she is a planeswalker with daybound, nightbound. So, your deck's going to like it when it's nighttime as much as possible. And Arlen likes it when it's nighttime too, although both her sides are actually pretty good. She does make wolf tokens, and she can become a werewolf herself with her 0 ability on her Moon's Fury side. So she takes advantage of some of those synergies. Primal Adversary doesn't have a wolf payoff or anything like that, but it makes a bunch of your lands into wolves, potentially, in addition to being a wolf itself. So this is one of the places where it fits really well. It's going to be good in any green deck, but still. Tovalar Dire Overlord, meanwhile, is another werewolf. His front side is also a werewolf payoff. You've noticed a lot of them are only on the Nightbound side, but Tovalar on the front side really likes wolves and werewolves. Each one that hits your opponent draws you a card, and he can also just make it into night, all on his own if you have enough wolves or werewolves in play, in which case he transforms into, a scary werewolf version of himself, still holds on to the draw a card effect, but also gains the ability to make werewolves gain trample and +X/+0. There's also the Celestis, a card that you can use to, try to make it keep it at night as much as possible, and night and day changing in general give you some value there. So that's werewolves. It's a pretty traditional red-green aggro deck, but it's got some pretty sweet night and day Innistrad stuff going on. Next up, let's look at vampires, which is black-red. This is a color pair, you have, kind of like with werewolves, I guess, you have both a tribal theme and then a mechanical one. The mechanical one being, the werewolf deck really likes nighttime. The red-black deck is a vampire deck that also has a bunch of cards with Bloodthirst-like effects. They don't actually say Bloodthirst on them, hence the quotations. Bloodthirst is an old mechanic from way back in original Ravnica originally, and basically it gave you some sort of bonus if you'd done damage to the opponent. This is slightly different, but it's similar. Basically, a lot of these vampires like it if an opponent has lost life during the turn, which is flavorful for vampires. So, Vampire Socialite embodies both of those things. First up, it's just a very efficient creature as a 2-mana 2/2 with Menace, but then it has a couple of different effects if opponents lose life. One of them is that if you play her and your opponent has lost life already, and you have other vampires in play, when you put her into play, she puts a +1/+1 counter on all your other vampires. So she's vampire synergy and bloodthirst stuff going on too. And similarly, if you play her before you play vampires, which is going to happen because she's a 2-drop, if your opponent loses life, then other vampires you have come into play after they've lost that life get an additional +1/+1 counter. So Vampire Socialite really embodies what this is about. Hungry for More is the other signpost uncommon, and it's, not a vampire payoff exactly, but the creature tokens it makes are really obnoxious. They're not things your opponent are really going to want to block because they're temporary. And that means, they also have trample, and that means they're often going to be taking damage, which will then set up things like Vampire Socialite. So let's look first at the Vampire Payoffs. There aren't a ton of them that are just straight up Vampire Payoffs, but the ones that do exist mostly interact one way or another with this Bloodthirst thing. You've got the Socialite, which we've already seen, but you've also got Stromkirk Bloodthief, who at your instep, if your opponent has lost life this turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on one of your vampires. That can include itself, by the way. Neonate's Rush is a nice card for this deck. Going to be a very key common for it, I think, because it will only cost 1 and a red most of the time because you'll have a vampire, and then it has the ability to do 1 damage to a creature and 1 damage to its controller and draw you a card. So sometimes you'll kill an X1 with it when you use it, and that'll be amazing. Other times you'll just be using it to get Bloodthirst going, but it replaces itself, so it's really worth the card, especially when you have payoffs like the Bloodthief and Vampire Socialite. And then there's also Voldaren Ambusher, who, like the Socialite and the Stromkirk Bloodthief, is not only a vampire payoff, but a Bloodthirst payoff. And in this case, it can do X damage to one target creature or planeswalker, where X is the number of vampires you control, if your opponent has lost life this turn. So those are the straight up vampire payoffs, but there's also several other Bloodthirst payoffs, cards that do extra things for you that mostly are vampires too. Like Arrogant Outlaw, who drains the opponent too if your opponent has lost life. Bat Whisperer, a vampire that gives you a 1/1 bat if your opponent has lost life. Blood Tithe Collector, a flying vampire with a pretty efficient body already that also makes your opponent discard a card if they've lost life. Famished Foragers, which will give you 3 red mana if your opponent has lost life. Mounted Dread Knight, which will give you a +1/+1 counter on its already reasonably efficient body if your opponent has lost life. And we've already seen the Ambusher and the Socialite, who both fit into this as well. And, we also saw the other +1/+1 counter guy. So what are some of the ways you can trigger Bloodthirst that this deck's going to be after? Well, a lot of them are vampires. So you can see the synergy here is pretty simple. You've got Vampire Interloper, a nice efficient creature who can be, getting in for damage early and turning on your Bloodthirst things. Hungry for More, we already saw, makes those tokens. Dreadhound is a little bit later in the game, but hey, sometimes in the late game you need to trigger those things. And, it makes your opponent lose life anytime a creature dies or is put into a graveyard from a library, and it mills you when it comes into play, so it'll usually do at least 1 to your opponent. You've got Siege Zombie, which lets you tap down a bunch of creatures to make opponents lose life. Brimstone Vandal, a card that does 1 damage to your opponent anytime night and day change. Burn the Accursed. It's kind of expensive, but if you have some of these passive payoffs, the fact that this will kill their creature and do 2 damage to your opponent then means you can start triggering your Bloodthirst things. Falconwrath Perforator, a nice little 2-drop vampire that does 1 every time it attacks, which is great for all of these Bloodthirst things. Neonate's Rush, we already saw. Thermo Alchemist, probably a little bit better in the blue-red deck, but it's also a repeatable way to keep triggering Bloodthirst, so it's pretty good here too. And Voldaren Stinger is just a creature that's really obnoxious to block if you have mana up, and your opponent just has to take it a lot of the time, which then means your Bloodthirst things will come online. So what are rares well suited to this deck? Well, there's Falconwrath Pitfighter, a 1-mana 2/1 vampire that if your opponent has lost life on their turn, you can pay a cost, discard a card, and sacrifice a vampire to draw 2 cards, and it can sacrifice itself. And more impressively, there's also Florian Voldaren Scion, a 3-mana 3/3 with First Strike, which gives you insane card advantage and card selection if you manage to do more than 1 damage to your opponent in a turn. All right, let's move now to blue-black, where, again, we have sort of a tribal theme, but there's also a mechanical one. The tribal theme is zombies, as it always is on Innistrad, but the sub-theme here is in particular zombie tokens that have decay, which we'll see in a moment. Neither of these cards actually say decay. They don't make those zombie tokens. We'll see them in a minute, but both of these cards do things with zombies. So Blade Stitch Scab, Zombie Lord, and it has good stats to begin with. And Corpse Cobble works well with these decay tokens. These decay tokens I'm talking about are very shortly on this world or they're useless because they can't block, and after they attack, they die. So a card like Corpse Cobble gives you the ability to turn all of those vampire tokens, rather zombie tokens, into one big zombie token. I don't think it's an amazing card all the time, but it's definitely going to have some synergy in this deck. So what are the zombie payoffs? Well, there's actually only a couple of things that are straight up zombie payoffs. You've already seen Blade Stitch Scab, but there's also Crawl from the Cellar, a common that lets you return a creature card from your graveyard, and you can put a +1/+1 counter on a zombie you control. So, regular old zombie stuff is not the big focus here. It's really on these zombie tokens. So let's talk about them. So what cards make these tokens? Well, you've got Falcon Abomination. So the thing about these zombie tokens, as bad as they are sort of in a vacuum, being unable to block and dying after they attack, is that they're tacked onto a lot of cards that are already playable, so they're almost free. So a lot of the value of this deck is going to come from finding a way to make those mediocre zombie tokens better than they look. One way is to just pump all your zombies like the Zombie Lord does, but we'll see other ways too. But a card like Falcon Abomination, it's a 3-mana 2/2 with flying. You'd play that a lot anyway, and by the way, it also gives you one of these tokens. Flip the Switch, not as exciting of a card, but you see these 3-mana counter target spell unless its controller pays 4 cards all the time, and this one just tacks a zombie onto it. Revenge of the Drowned, it lets you time ebb a creature, and it tacks a zombie onto it. It's sort of a zombie mana war of sorts. Startle, this card does a whole bunch of little things, and one of the things it does is just tack on a zombie in addition to the fact that it replaces itself. Diregraph Horde, probably going to be really key for this deck. It does cost 5, so you can't run like a million, but it's a really good common because it gives you 3 zombie bodies, counting itself and the 2/2/2 black zombies it creates. You've got Ghoulish Procession. This card's a little awkward. I almost feel like we'll talk about the black-white deck later. It might actually make more sense there because this deck really wants to be giving up its zombie tokens in the first place, and a zombie token dying doesn't trigger it, but other things dying does give you one of these tokens. Hobbling Zombie, a 3-mana 2/2 with Death Touch. That's a playable card all the time, and oh, by the way, this one spits out another token when it dies. No Way Out, it's Mind Rot with a zombie attached to it. Rotten Reunion gives you a way to hate on your opponent's graveyard and get 2 zombie tokens out of 1 card because of Flashback. So how do you utilize these seemingly worthless zombie tokens? In addition to the fact that you can attack with them, and if your opponent just has X2s, that is a really real source of damage, but there's other more interesting ways to utilize them. One way is with a bunch of cards that let you tap down untapped creatures you control. So, you're going to end up in situations where your zombie tokens can't block, which they never can, but they also can't attack. There's no reason to attack with them because your opponent can just block them with their X3. And when you sort of stall out like that, they gave you a few cards that let you tap down these useless zombies for effects. This is not an exciting one. It lets you, get some card selection and fill your graveyard a bit, but it is an example of that. More interestingly, there's things like Scob Wrangler, which you can use up all your zombies, tap them all down to tap down creatures and then untap, and suddenly your zombies can attack. So this gives you a way to utilize all those extra zombies. You've got Vivisection, a card that lets you just throw away one of these free zombies to draw 3 cards, which is a good deal. We've got Corpse Cobble, which now you probably get now how it can work with these zombies. You can actually attack with them, and then when they're like, we're all going to die trigger is on the stack, you can cast Corpse Cobble, sacrifice them all, and turn them into one big menacey zombie. Again, I don't love how it works because it's kind of an all eggs in one basket kind of thing. But the zombie tokens are kind of free and they're going to die anyway, so it does kind of work here. You've got Morkrut Behemoth, a creature that can be a 5-mana 7/6 with Menace if you give up anything, but ideally a zombie token. Eaten Alive is a really nice, efficient removal spell when you sacrifice a creature to it, like a zombie token. Morbid Opportunist likes it when these zombie tokens die, so you can draw a card every time one does. And this gives you a reason to attack with a worthless zombie token, even if it's never going to get in for damage because it'll just draw you a card. Necrosynthesis, an aura that I don't love, but it's another card that says, sure, attack with those zombies because it gives you an effect when they die, in this case, +1/+1 counters. Siege Zombie, another one of these things where you're like, okay, my zombies can't attack, but I can use them to tap them all down and make my opponent lose life. Ecstatic Awakener is a creature that can transform, that can ideally eat a zombie in this deck and then turn into a 4/4 demon. So this deck looks pretty cool to me. It's an interesting take on zombies. I think these decay zombie tokens are a really interesting design space, and I think it looks like they did a pretty good job of sort of supporting them, getting you as much value as you can out of these seemingly bad zombie tokens. So what rares fit well here? Well, you've got Gisa, Glorious Resurrector. She's really good in any deck at all because she's a 4-mana 4/4 that lets you steal your opponent's creatures when they die. But this deck is already well equipped to take advantage of decay, and the things she steals do come back with decay. That's sort of the downside. And since it's already well equipped to gain value out of that, it makes sense that she'd be really good here as opposed to just, well, I guess really, really good here and only really good in most other decks. Jadar, Ghoul Collar of Nephalia is kind of a weird card because if you have a bunch of zombie tokens, he doesn't really work that well for you. But since you can cash them in with regularity, attack with them, whatever, he can also just crank one out every turn for you to get value out of. Poppet Stitcher is a spell payoff that makes zombie creature tokens with Decayed. You're going to have enough spells in this deck to support it, especially because he's a 3-mana 2/3, and especially because he just likes tokens in general. He doesn't actually have to be the ones to make them, and when he sees enough tokens around him, he can transform into Poppet Factory, and when he does, he turns all those tokens, who are 2/2 decay zombies, into 3/3s that lose decay. So they're suddenly no longer mediocre tokens, now they're really, really good tokens. So he's going to be great in this deck. You've also got Hostile, clever name for a card, but also a good place to throw away all your zombies because eventually it can transform into Creeping In, a pretty imposing creature. Grafted Identity, a card that's going to be good in pretty much any blue deck. However, It gets the bonus here because you have these extra zombie tokens to sacrifice to it. And there's also Champion of the Perished, a creature that really likes these zombie tokens, because if you're putting multiple into play, which a few cards let you do, it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So it likes zombies in general, but it really likes cards that like put 2 zombie bodies into play, and we've already seen a few of those. So that's blue-black. It's a new take on zombies, one that I think is pretty interesting. Let's look now at green-white. So, in the past on Innistrad, green-white is all about humans. That's not really the case here. There's a little bit of a human sub-theme in green-white, but it's mostly on like rares and mythic rares, and there's like one common that cares about humans. Mostly, this color pairs about a new mechanic called Coven, and it also has a go wide element, and that's really embodied by Dawnheart Wardens here, a 3-mana 3/3 with Vigilance, who has a Coven ability. And what Coven is an ability word that basically indicates when you have 3 or more creatures that have different power, like as in power and toughness, you get some effect. And in this case, at the beginning of combat, she'll give your whole board +1/+0. So she's a Coven payoff, and she gives your whole board +1/+0 when it does go off, and that's nice. And then the other signpost in common is really just about making these creatures join the dance. In the end, can give you 4 1/1 human creature tokens, which is pretty nice. And a 1/1 plus Dawnheart Wardens is already 2/3 of the way to Coven, so they can kind of help you there too. So let's look at the other cards with Coven now, see what kind of bonuses we're getting. We've seen Dawnheart Warden. There's also Candlegrove Witch, who can gain flying at the beginning of combat on your turn if you have Coven going. Candle Trap, which goes from being kind of a medium removal spell to a really good one if you get Coven going, because you can sacrifice it to exile the creature it's attached to, as opposed to just giving the creature Defender earlier in the game. Dual Craft Trainer, if you have Coven, at the beginning of combat, he gives one of your creatures double strike. And you'll notice, by the way, a lot of these say at the beginning of combat. So this is an aggro deck. It's about having creatures with different power, sort of a thing we don't really think about most of the time, but it's still an aggro deck. These are all things that make your creatures into better attackers. Ritual of Hope is, another card like the Wardens that really embodies what this deck is about, because it's a mass pump spell that gets more potent if you have Coven going. Candlelit Cavalry gains trample at the beginning of combat if you have Coven. Contortionist Troop, I think, is going to be a really key uncommon for this deck, because it can customize its power, basically, because it has an X-costed casting cost. And then it also has a pretty powerful Coven ability. It's kind of a weird one in that it does it at your instep instead of at the beginning of combat like the rest of these. But that does mean the turn you play it, you get a counter instead of having to wait until combat like with these other ones. Duel for Dominance is going to go from being kind of a medium removal spell to a really good one in a deck that can get Coven going, because you get a +1/+1 counter in addition to the fight effect. Harvest Tide Sentry becomes harder to block if you have Coven at the beginning of combat. Might of the Old Ways is a trick with Coven that draws you a card if you have Coven. One cool thing about it is that it checks for Coven only after you give something +2/+2. So it's going to be kind of easy to draw that card. Ritual Guardian gains lifelink at the beginning of combat if you have Coven. Ambitious Farmhand can transform into a 3/3 with lifelink if you have Coven. So we know Coven's a big part of this deck. This is a bunch of commons and uncommons that tell you that. And we already saw the signposts. How do you go about getting Coven? Are there some tricks to it? And I think the answer is, yeah, there are a few. You've got cards like Clarion Cathars, which goes well with going wide, which is part of the deck's theme, but it also gives you one creature with 1 power and one creature with 3 power. All you need is one other creature, and you've got Coven. There's Gavany Silversmith, who can come in and alter the power of creatures, or put a counter on itself too and be a 3/4. That's going to make it easier for you to get Coven. There's Gavany Trapper, a creature with 0 power, which there's not a lot of around, and it's also just a nice card in general. So if you play this on turn 1, curving out like with a 2-mana 2/2 and a 3-mana 3/3 and just having Coven, not that crazy. Hedge Witch's Mask isn't a great piece of equipment, but it's another card that lets you bump up a creature's power, and that matters in this deck. Dawnheart Mentor, like Clarion Cathars, gives you 2 bodies for 1 card, and then it also has Coven itself. Homestead Courage, this is going to be an interesting card. If this format's really aggressive, it's going to end up being good. And if it's going to be good anywhere, here is a pretty likely place because of its ability to put counters on things, which will increase your chances of getting Coven. Bramble Armor is a better piece of equipment than Hedge Witch's Mask because it equips right away, so it can alter power immediately and more efficiently, generally speaking, at least the first time. We already saw the Troop. It allows you to give it as much power as you want. Timberland Guide, another card that brings a counter along, so it can do some stuff with Coven. Audric's Outrider puts counters on things. You do have to have things die, but if you have a lot of tokens, then that's going to be happening. Beloved Beggar, another 0 power creature, and then he's one that can come back big as a 4/4 flyer with Vigilance later, and either of those bodies seems useful for getting Coven going. So let's look now at the other theme for the deck, the going wide theme. So how do you go wide? Well, you've got Join the Dance, you've got Clarion Cathars, these are really cards we've already seen. Ritual of Hope is a payoff, Dawnheart Mentor gives you the 2 bodies. Rise of the Ants, one we haven't talked about yet. It's probably going to be a little better in like the blue-green deck, which is sort of a slower, grindier flashback deck, but it does help you go wide, and who knows, maybe the 3/3 will help you get your Coven going. Cathar's Call, a bit risky as an aura, but it does help you go wide and can potentially give you 1/1s, which you might need for Coven. Lunarch Veteran is a card that pays you off for going wide because you gain life off of things that come into play. His other side is a 1/1 flyer, like when he's disturbed, that gains you life when things leave the battlefield, and that can be useful too. So what rares fit here? Well, the ones with Coven. You've got Augur of Autumn, which is already a really good card, but if you have Coven going, you can just play creatures off the top of your library as well as lands. Adeline Resplendent Cathar is another one of these cards that gives you 2 bodies, which usually means 2/3 of Coven, and she also likes it when you go wide because it changes her power. Sigarda, Champion of Light, is a human lord. You'll notice most of the creatures we're looking at are humans. This is where, human is like the 3rd theme within this color pair beneath Coven, beneath going wide. But Sigarda is a mythic rare that says, hey, look, all your humans get pumped, and it just so happens pretty much all the creatures we talked about are humans, so she's going to be quite powerful. And then she, of course, has a Coven ability that lets you find humans in the top 5 cards of your library. Sun Gold Sentinel has a Coven ability that allows her to gain hexproof from a particular color and become unblockable by that color. Primal Adversary I have here because it helps you go wide. It also gives you 2/3 of Coven all on its own if you kick it once, play it as for 5 mana. Intrepid Adversary pumps your whole board. Rite of Harmony, this card looks like it's going to be a little tricky to make work, but it's going to work. First of all, it's green-white, so obviously this will be the deck where it does work, if it finds a place to work, and where it'll work is if you play it before a card that gives you like 2 bodies, in which case, you're kind of making some nice value there. Catilda, she is another human payoff. Again, she's a rare. She makes all your humans able to tap for mana, and she can also pump your whole board, which goes pretty well with the go wide theme. All right, let's move to blue-white now. So blue-white on Innistrad is usually spirits, and it sort of is this time too. Like most of the cards that are in this color pair happen to be spirits, but the spirit type itself isn't a huge focus. Instead, it's mostly a graveyard deck that focuses on Flashback, an old-school Innistrad mechanic, and actually it's even older than Innistrad, but appeared in original Innistrad, and Disturb, which is another graveyard mechanic. And Devoted Graphkeeper does a good job of sort of embodying this idea, in that he is a 2-mana 2/1 that mills 2 cards. So you like milling yourself in this deck some because you can get access to Disturb cards. And he also has an extra bonus. Whenever you cast a spell from your graveyard, you tap target creature you don't control. And that includes both Disturb and Flashback. And then he, of course, has Disturb, which allows him, when he's in the graveyard, you can pay 1 generic, a blue, and a white, and he comes back as this 3/1 flyer that can block only creatures with flying. The other signpost is Faithful Mending. It's less sort of in your face about this than Devoted Graphkeeper is, but it lets you loot, and it has Flashback, and both of those things line up well here. So what are the Flashback and Disturb payoffs? Well, you've got Devoted Graphkeeper, of course. You've also got Loyal Gryff. It's sort of a roundabout payoff for Disturb in that you can use it to reset a Disturb creature. It can be particularly potent if your opponent's like going to kill your Disturb creature, it's in play as a spirit, and then you play Loyal Gryff, return it to your hand. So it's not like an amazing payoff, but it does work here pretty well. Plus the deck is kind of just a Flyers deck, and Loyal Gryff fits in well there. Similarly, Fading Hope does the same kind of thing. You can use it to reset one of your creatures that's going to die anyway, and you even get to scry a lot of the time when you cast it. Geist Wave is going to be the more interesting way of all of these to do this, I think. Save a creature and reset it, one of these Disturbed creatures. Because if you bounce your own thing, you draw a card, and then you're getting back basically a whole card of value because you're recasting it as a creature in the first place. So that's going to be some pretty sweet value in the deck. There's also Ominous Roost, a card that just likes it when you cast any spells from your graveyard, whether they're Disturb or Flashback spells. Gives you a bunch of bird tokens. Phantom Carriage, which searches up a Disturb card or a Flashback card and throws it in your graveyard. You've got Shipwreck Sifters. This is one of the few cards that's like a straight up Spirit payoff, but it's more generally also a Disturb payoff. Because when you discard a card with Disturb or a Spirit, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and it loots when it comes into play. Unblinking Observer fits really well here because you can use it to cast cards with Disturb and Flashback, because all the cards with Flashback are instants and sorceries, and it can cast those. And then you get access to some of these sacrifice things we saw in blue, like Vivisection. Like, if you can give up the front side of one of these Disturbed creatures, some of them are pretty unimpressive on the front and pretty impressive when you bring them back, it's going to feel similar to giving up those zombie tokens. So what are some other graveyard payoffs? Well, there's a couple. Locked in the Cemetery, the more cards you have in your graveyard, the better it gets as a removal spell. And Bereaved Survivor might be tricky to flip in this deck. You can do it, but it might be tricky to do. But her other side, the Dauntless Avenger side, can reanimate small things, and a lot of your small things happen to also have Disturb. So that is pretty cool. So how do you load the graveyard? Well, there's ways. I mean, you've got Consider. I mean, one thing to keep in mind here is you shouldn't go all out on trying to load the graveyard. You definitely get value out of it, but you get the most value out of a lot of these cards by casting both sides and trading both sides. Some of them, that's not true. Some of them just don't have a good front side, and you just want to get to the back side right away. And that's true with some of the Flashback cards too. It's better to draw a card and throw a card in your graveyard that you can flashback later than it is to draw that card sometimes. But a lot of the time you should not be going out of your way to load up your graveyard. It's good as incidental value, but don't force it really hard. But Consider can help you with that. You can put one card into your graveyard. Drownyard Amalgam mills 3 things when it comes into play. Oregon Hoarder gives you some nice card selection. You get to put 1 thing in your hand and 2 into your graveyard. Covetous Castaway is a creature with Disturb that also mills cards when it comes into play, so it fits perfectly here. And when it comes back after being disturbed, it's a 3/4 flyer. Overwhelmed Archivist helps you throw things in your graveyard, and it's also a disturbed creature that comes back as a 2/1 that loots every time it attacks. Faithful Mending, we've already seen, helps you sort of set up your graveyard to some extent. Otherworldly Gaze, I think, is probably terrible, but if there's a deck for it, it's probably this one, because this one can get the most value out of the graveyard. What makes it bad is the fact that you don't ever get that card of value back. Even if you mill all cards with Flashback, it's hard to say you're getting the value back from casting this in the first place, and you're not going to do that anyway. I've also got Shipwreck Sifters, we've seen already, lets you discard a card from your hand when it comes into play. And Celestis Sanctifier, anytime day or night shifts, you get to look at the top card of your library and you can put it in your graveyard. The big theme here is Flashback and Disturb and getting 2-for-1s out of all those cards, and loading the graveyard is sort of a secondary theme. So rares, what rares fit in well here? Well, we've got a rare who has Disturb, and on his front side, he protects your graveyard from spells or abilities, which is nice because there is some legit graveyard hate in this format at all rarities. And when he comes back as a very impressive creature, a 3/2 flyer that lets you investigate anytime creature cards are put into graveyards from anywhere, which is going to generate a ton of value. You've got Grafted Identity again here. It's, like the zombie deck, you can sack a zombie token. In this deck, you can sacrifice, like your Denick, which then sets you up next turn to play him as a disturbed creature. Lier, Disciple of the Drowned, gives all your cards Flashback, and you have lots of payoffs for Flashback to begin with. All your instants and sorceries, I should say, gain it. Patrician Geist, here's a rare that actually cares about spirits. It pumps them all, and, all of the disturbed creatures are spirits, and it also makes all of your disturb and flashback cost 1 less, so it fits great here. Sigardian Savior is a creature I have here. I mean, it's a bomb that's going to be good in any deck, but this deck will be loading the graveyard some, and the ability to bring back 2 things with converted mana value 2 or less is a little more likely here. Hallowed Respite, another card I don't love. It is a blue-white rare, but the effect it has is really underwhelming. The one thing it can do, and we've seen it, I've talked about it some on other cards, is that it can reset your creatures who are disturbed. They can come back as creatures, so you get that value again, but all the other cards that can do that also do other things, and Hallowed Respite barely does. So I don't love it, but if it ends up being good, this deck is going to be why. So from here, let's move to blue-green, which is kind of an adjacent deck. It's a blue-green flashback deck that also really cares about ramp. It's going to be a good ramp deck. So the main signpost uncommon is Root Coil Creeper here, which does all kinds of stuff for a 2-mana creature. It can ramp you and add mana of any color, but it can also add extra mana to cast spells from your graveyard, which includes Disturb and Flashback. And then it has an additional ability that lets you get back a card with Flashback from exile to your hand. The other Signpost Uncommon, of course, has Flashback, but it's also, a card that lets you tap down your opponent's thing and put a counter on one of your things. And if you can cast this, in back-to-back turns or 2 turns in a row, it can really alter the game. So what are the Flashback Payoffs? Well, you've got Rootcoil Creeper and Midnight Roost, of course, or Omnis Roost, rather, and Phantom Carriage. That's actually it. So the interesting thing here is that, the payoffs for Flashback aren't, all over the place here. We don't have a lot of them. But the way this deck is constructed, the way it has a bunch of ramp is basically, the blue-white deck is going to be more interested in casting the cheaper things with Flashback, and this deck is more interested in casting the more expensive things with Flashback because it's more set up for the ramp with something like Rootcoil Creeper, which gives you double mana to flash things back. And then you have access to a couple of other commons. You've got Dawnheart Rejuvenator and Path to the Festival, for example, both of which help you ramp even more, help you fix your mana. This is going to be the color pair where you can really just splash relatively easily just by getting a few commons and your Signpost Uncommon. There are various things you can ramp into. 2 of them, I think, that are key are Rise of the Ants and Shadow Beast Sighting. Both of these are, give you decent value when you cast them, but then have very expensive flashback costs. This deck will be able to pay these expensive flashback costs in the later game thanks to all of its ramp. And Phantom Carriage will also be easier to get to. There's also some assorted other things, that aren't flashbacky that you can ramp into, but these are the ones that are super synergistic with what we've got going on here. What rares work here? Well, Memory Deluge is a card with a high flashback cost, so it works here. Willow Geist likes it when cards leave your graveyard, and that includes flashing things back. Lier gives all your cards, we've already seen it in your graveyard, flashback. And Patrician Geist, which we've also seen, pumps all your spirits. But more importantly for this deck, also reduces the cost of spells cast from your graveyard. So blue-green is a flashback deck mostly, and a ramp deck as well. And, I think the big difference between the two is just going to be that you're slamming these big green flashback cards into this deck that you can't really, well, first of all, you're not running green and blue-white, but they're harder for you to get to in the blue-white deck, which doesn't have access to nearly as much ramp. All right, let's move now to blue-red, which, this is one that has pretty much stayed the same. Pretty much every visit to Innistrad, I guess the first time around it was a little more flashbacky. This time around it's just about spells more generally, and that's what it was last time too. Both of these cards tell you that Arcane Infusion lets you look at the top 4 cards of your library and you reveal an instant or sorcery and put one of them into your hand. So you need to be running a lot of instants and sorceries, and if you are, it's a pretty nice card because it ultimately will give you a 2-for-1 and give you access. It's one card giving you access to 2 cards and decent card selection. And then Storm Skrillex over here decreases the cost of your instants and sorceries and likes it when you cast them. So, we've seen spell decks before where spells are kind of a sub-theme, it's just sort of there. But the way this deck looks, I think most of the time you're going to want to jam about 10 instants or sorceries into your deck, and you're going to want some of them to have flashback too, because that gives you access to more triggers like Storm Skrillexes. So this is a very heavy spell deck that's usually not going to have a ton of creatures in it. All right, so what spell payoffs do we have at common and uncommon? Well, we've of course got the 2 signposts, but you've also got Unblinking Observer. You can tap mana to cast instants and sorceries. Ardent Elementalist, a creature that returns an instant or sorcery to your hand when it enters the battlefield. Festival Crasher, a creature that gets +2/+0 when you play an instant or sorcery. Seize the Storm, probably going to be a pretty key card in this deck the more I think about it. I think I underrated it a little bit in my set review already. I think I gave it a C+. Seems more like it might be a B- or a B. It just seems like you're going to be playing enough spells in this deck that casting this is going to give you a very real win condition, especially after you cast it the second time with Flashback. It also counts cards that have been exiled with Flashback, and kind of has to in this format or it would be a little frustrating, so it's good they did that. But yeah, seems like a legit win condition at uncommon for the deck, just like the Skrillex does. Thermo Alchemist, also a pretty legit win condition. It's going to do a ton of damage when you're casting spells and stuff. Untaps every time you cast an instant or sorcery. Keeps pinging your opponent. Delver of Secrets. So, Delver's not amazing in limited, despite how great it is in multiple constructed formats. And, it's one of the best creatures of all time. But if you have 10 instants and sorceries in your deck, it's going to flip in, 3 to 4 turns. And it becomes a 3/2 flyer. And sometimes it'll flip even sooner. So it's probably okay in this deck. It's not great, because, you know, it's going to feel great if you play it on turn 1 and just flip it right away, which is what people do in other formats, but you can't really count on that. But it does seem reasonable here. We've got Flame Channeler, so it checks for spells specifically that do damage, and they're around. There's a decent number of them. It's hard to really get a feeling for how many you'll get, but my instinct is like, you know, you're probably going to have 10 spells, and 3 of them are probably going to do damage. And that's definitely enough to play the Channeler, because all you have to do is deal damage with a spell, and then it transforms into Embodiment of Flame, which is a bigger creature that also likes it when you continue to damage things with spells. I mean, ideally you have like 7 spells that do damage, but that's not going to be that easy to pull off, because everyone's going to want the red removal spells. But, you know, we'll see how good it is exactly. Spellrune Painter is a werewolf that likes it when spells are cast on both sides. So what rares do we have that fit into this deck? Well, we've got Vadric, Astral Archmage. He reduces the cost of spells equal to his power, and he's a night-day payoff. So every time night and day change, he gets a counter. So he's going to reduce spells more and more. And with Flashback around in the format, that's going to be more relevant more often than it is in other formats. Galvanic Iteration gives you a fork effect, sort of. I mean, it lets you copy an instant or sorcery spell. You actually have to play it first, then you play a spell that gets copied, and then you can flash it back. So sometimes it's going to be really silly. We've seen Lier a lot. It's a bomb, but, you know, this deck's going to have a lot of instants and sorcery, so it's going to have a lot of flashback when Lier's in play. And then there's also Geist Flame Reservoir. This card gets a counter every time you play an instant or sorcery, and you can remove those counters to do damage to stuff, in addition to the fact that it can let you sort of draw cards. Poppet Stitcher, we've already seen. You know, he is a spell payoff that makes decay zombies. Smoldering Egg is a spell payoff. It checks the converted mana cost. Actually, check that. It checks the mana value you spend on any card, any instant or sorcery you cast, and then removes that many counters from it. It starts out with 7 of them. So you can see that it's pretty doable to transform it into Ashmouth Dragon, a creature with a powerful payoff for playing instants and sorcery, since it shocks stuff. So that's blue-red. It's about spells. We see it all the time. Still looks like a ton of fun to me. All right, next up we have black-white, which is a sacrifice deck. You know, this is a thing we see in a lot of formats, a sacrifice deck. It's been a while since we've seen it in black-white. It's usually in black-red, but it's in black-white here, as these 2 cards show you. Flesh Taker is a really sweet signpost uncommon with really unsettling art. That every time you sack a creature, you gain a life and scry 1, so that's a nice sacrifice payoff, but it also has the ability to sacrifice creatures itself and gain +2/+2 until end of turn, and that's the kind of ability that the threat of activation is a real problem. You've also got Rite of Oblivion, which is a card that lets you exile a non-land permanent. You can flash it back, and this color pair has access to a lot of things that you feel perfectly happy sacrificing, so that's not as big of a cost as it looks. All right, so let's look at sacrifice effects and payoffs at common and uncommon. We, of course, have our 2 signposts. You've also got Cathar Commando, so it can give itself up to destroy artifacts or enchantments. It's not exactly, you know, perfectly fitting in with this deck, but it does combo with Flesh Taker, and that's nice. Audric's Outrider loves it when things die, and so if you're sacrificing things, it gives you another bonus. Sunset Revelry is a little weird, so it's kind of a roundabout kind of card that fits well into this deck, probably best of any. I'm a bit skeptical because it does seem like it'll only be good when you're behind, but what makes it good here is that you can find a way to sacrifice things for value and then cast it and then get those 2 bodies and then maybe one of the other effects, and those 2 bodies can also be sacrificed to, you know, your Flesh Taker or whatever. So it looks like it could be interesting here because you'll have more control over your creatures in play than most decks. Unruly Mob likes it when things die, so it fits well here. We've seen Dreadhound already. It likes it when things die as well. That damages your opponent when they do. Eaten Alive, we've seen too. It lets you sacrifice a thing and, you know, be more efficient. Ghoulish Procession, I mentioned this earlier. It's probably going to be a little better here. This deck does have access to all the black cards that make 2/2 zombies, and those are going to work really well alongside sacrifice and death synergies like Unruly Mob and Flesh Taker and Audric's Outrider. But it's not all about those. It has some other things that are going to be sacrificed too, and that works a little better with Ghoulish Procession because it wants you to sacrifice non-tokens, and this deck will be doing it more, so then you get another body to sacrifice. You've also got Morbid Opportunist again, who likes it when things die because you draw a card. Morcrit Behemoth lets you sack a thing to come down earlier. Necrosynthesith likes it when things die because, you know, it makes your creature bigger. Bereaved Survivor probably a little better here than in some of the other decks because it'll be easier for you to transform it because it'll be easier for you to make some other creature die. So what do you sacrifice here? Well, You've got Cathar's Call, a card that generates tokens you can sacrifice. Like I said before, it's a little risky, but it does do the job. Clarion Cathar is a card that gives you 2 bodies, is great in a sacrifice deck. Search Party Captain is nice because he comes down and draws you a card right away, so he's already given you a card worth of value. So, then sacrificing him to some effect doesn't feel too bad. If you can damage the opponent, Bat Whisperer gives you a couple of bodies, and that works pretty well here too. Diregraph Horde going to be nice here too. I mean, again, think about Flesh Taker or, the Mob or those kinds of cards. Once you have all these zombie bodies in play, they're just going to grow massive. Hobbling Zombie, another card that gives you 2 bodies for 1 card. Novice Occultist, a nice thing to sacrifice because when you do, you get to draw a card out of it. Rotten Reunion gives you a couple of zombie bodies and 1 card. Beloved Beggar, so I have him here sort of as a stand-in for all the white cards with Disturb. So this deck kind of gets access to 2 of the sort of card advantage sources in the set, which are those 2/2 zombies from black, and then all the cards that are in white that have Disturb, because you can just sack their front side and get serious value out of it. Vengeful Stranger, going to be best in this deck because it's very hard to make your Strangler die because your opponent, it can't block, and your opponent may be taking 2 from it every turn, but they may also just be able to do that without any real problems. So if you really need to transform it, and when it transforms, it turns into an enchantment that goes onto a creature that makes them sack a non-land and lose a life every turn. They can sack that creature eventually. So if you really want to transform the Strangler, this is going to be the deck where you can do it the most easily. What are the rares? Well, you've got Can't Stay Away, my vote for best art in this pack, as you can see, in this set, rather, as you can see from the background. It works well because you can sack these bodies and then bring them back and then sacrifice them again, and in the end you get a 2-for-1. Liesa is a bomb. You'll splash her in any white deck, probably, but if you're in white-black, first of all, easiest to cast her, and second of all, you can just keep sacking things and returning them to your hand, and obviously that works pretty well with the whole strategy. We've got Sir Guardian Savior here. If you sack small things early, you can get them back later. Jadar, probably a little better here too than it is in actually the blue-black deck because you're less likely to have zombies, and it will more easily just crank out one for you every turn. Jaren, Corrupted Bishop, is interesting. He's kind of a human payoff in black, and there are humans around, as we've seen, but it's not heavy humans. But either way, he comes down, gives you 2 bodies all on his own, and then can generate more if you're sacrificing humans. And then occasionally he'll transform. I don't have Ormondal here, but when he transforms, he's a 6/6 with flying, lifelink, and trample, and he can just sack creatures to draw cards. So yeah, he's really strong when you can transform him. It won't happen a ton. We've got Hostile here again too. Works well in any of these decks that have access to, cards that give you more than 1 body one way or another. Let's move now to black-green, where it's what it usually is on Innistrad, which is, Morbid to some extent, and Undergrowth this time around to some extent too. Those are both mechanics that don't actually appear in this set, but these cards do them. Morbid is a mechanic where you get some sort of benefit if a creature has died this turn, and Undergrowth is a mechanic that specifically checks for creatures that have died, that are in the graveyard or have died. And so, the cards in black-green have these 2 mechanics. Like Diregraph Rebirth shows you, it wants creatures in your graveyard specifically, and it wants things to die. If that's true, it costs less to cast, and it can reanimate stuff, sometimes really cheaply, because things just happen to die. And Grisly Ghoul comes down with a +1/+1 counter for each creature that died on the turn. So what are some of the other cards that do this sort of thing? Well, we've already seen Morbid Opportunist a few times. You get to draw a card when a thing dies. You only get to do it once a turn, but still. Dreadhound, we've seen as well. It damages your opponent when stuff dies or gets milled. Necrosynthesis makes creatures bigger. Ghoulish Procession works kind of okay here too, because anytime a creature dies, you get a 2/2. Death Bonnet Sprout is a creature that transforms. First of all, it mills you, which is nice for this deck, but then if there are 3 or more creature cards in your graveyard, specifically creature cards, not just any old cards, it turns into Death Bonnet Hulk, which also likes to gobble up creatures in graveyards to gain stats. How do you load the graveyard? Mostly in ways we've seen. I've got Dreadhound. One way we haven't seen is Tapping at the Window, which is a nice card selection spell that loads up your graveyard. Eccentric Farmer, we've seen already, but yeah, it mills you some, gets you a land back sometimes. Heirloom Mirror lets you rummage, so you can throw things into your graveyard, and then it transforms into a creature that likes creatures in your graveyard, or your opponent's for that matter, because it gets bigger. What are the rares for this color pair? Well, We've got Ghoul Caller's Harvest, which checks for creatures in the graveyard, and for every one there is, you get a 2/2 black zombie with Decayed. Sometimes it can be a ton if you've milled yourself a lot, and it has Flashback, so, you know, if you do it once and you make a bunch of zombies and send them all at your opponent, you know, 5 or 6 even, then you do it again the next turn, it's going to be hard for your opponent to win. Old Stick Fingers can mill a bunch of your deck, and then she checks for creatures specifically in your graveyard. So this is where sort of the Overgrowth thing is coming in, or Undergrowth rather. You know, we saw it on a few commons and uncommons, but both of these rares, it's not just any card in your graveyard, and it's not that a creature has to have died this turn. It's that there has to be creatures in your graveyard for them to do their thing. The Meat Hook Massacre likes it when your creatures die. It's also just a bomb in general because it's a sweeper that does all kinds of other stuff. Wrenn and 7 fits in well here because it mills you. I guess that means it probably fits in well in blue-green as well. It's also just a super powerful card in any green deck. So, yeah. Consuming Blob likes it for more cards to be in your graveyard because that means there's more card types in there, so it gets bigger. And that means the token it makes gets bigger. Graveyard Trespasser, it likes cards in graveyards because it can consume them to drain people, and it can do it from your graveyard or your opponent's, and then when it becomes Graveyard Glutton, it can do it even better. So that is black-green. It's about stuff dying and creatures being in the graveyard. We've got one more color pair left, and it's, you know, probably the one that's the most typical for basically any set we see, and that's red-white, which is an aggro deck. It does have a bit of other stuff going on, but at its very core, it's probably the least synergistic of these decks in terms of like mechanics and creature types. It's mostly just about curving out with efficient creatures and killing people, which is always a good strategy for red-white. There is a little bit of a night-day sub-theme, which you can see on Sunrise Cavalier here. It's a 3-mana 3/3 with Trample and Haste. That's great already. And there's a bunch of cards in red-white that make it day if it's not already night or day, so they make sure that night or day are going to be tracked. And if they're already being tracked, they like it because they all give you some sort of bonus when you change night and day. So I'm going to focus really, you know, I'm not going to talk about the curve for this deck. It's fairly self-explanatory, but I will talk about the cards that have this night-day synergy and the kind of value they can give you. Obviously, the Cavalier is insane because it can put the counter wherever anytime night and day change. Do keep in mind with all of these, I made the mistake myself with my very first set review video before catching it in the later videos. It has to be night and then day, or day and then night for that to trigger. So if it's not already day or night and your thing comes into play and makes it day, doesn't count. So you're not going to get that trigger no matter what if it's not already night or day. So keep that in mind. So what are the payoffs? Well, they're all pretty efficient creatures, which, you know, makes sense. You've got the Cavalier, you've got Brimstone Vandal, who we've seen. You know, it pings the opponent every time night or day changes, and it's got decent stats and menace. Obsessive Astronomer is a bear that really helps you rip through your deck anytime night and day change. Gavany Dawnguard is really good. It lets you look for cheap cards at the top of your library anytime night and day change, cheap creatures that is. And you can see that that's what all of these are, and there's a lot more of them in red-white, so you're going to be able to pretty consistently draw a creature if you trigger Gavany Dawnguard, and if it sticks around, it's going to turn into a value engine. And less exciting, you've got Celestis Sanctifier, which gives you a bit of card selection when you change day or night, but it's still a reasonably efficient creature. So, you know, you've got these 2 commons and 3 uncommons that track night or day and do relatively powerful things, maybe except for the Sanctifier. And, you know, this deck's just an aggro deck with this interesting little sub-theme. Sort of punishes people for being really interested in night and day themselves, too, because your opponent may want it to shift to nighttime because they have a bunch of werewolves, and you're like, well, okay, but I get all of this value. So a rare that fits in well with this strategy is the Celestis. We've seen it already. It likes it when night and day change. It can change night and day, so it fits in well here. Like I said, you know, there's a whole bunch of aggressive creatures that just slot into this deck. That part of the deck is fairly self-explanatory, but there is this night and day theme that you need to keep in mind that you may want to be taking advantage of when you're drafting this red-white deck. All right, well, that is my archetype guide for Innistrad Midnight Hunt. So this limited season with Innistrad Midnight Hunt, I'm actually planning on putting out more content than I usually do. I mean, I put out draft videos and I'll be streaming and all of that will still be going on, but I'm also going to be doing a few videos, you know, talking about how my feelings about the format have changed, you know, what I think the best archetype is, you know, at some point in the future. So, you know, if you want to see those videos, including draft videos, future set reviews, I do top 10 videos. I make a lot of stuff. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to see my set review for this set that talks about each card in detail individually, you should see a playlist for that on your screen shortly. And if you enjoy this video, you think it's helpful, you think it'll help you, at your pre-release or drafting on Arena, share it with your friends because you want to help them too, right? So yeah, share it with as many people as you can and like it too. So thanks for watching.